In 2,000 years of imperial Chinese history, only one woman ever formally sat on the throne, but the number of women who actually wielded supreme power was far greater. They reviewed memorials, commanded armies, executed ministers, and set national policy. They did everything an emperor did. They were simply never allowed to sit in that chair. There is a pattern worth noticing. Nearly all of them appeared at the most dangerous moments in their dynasties. This was not coincidence. The system excluded them when it functioned normally and needed them when it broke down. To understand this, you first need to understand the world they lived in. The foundational logic of ancient Chinese society was the patrilineal clan system. Power passed from father to son along a bloodline, and women were not part of that chain. This was not the prejudice of any individual emperor. It was the basic architecture of the civilization itself. From the time the Zhou Dynasty codified ritual propriety, the division between male and female spheres was not a social convention, but part of the cosmic order. The Book of Rites stated that men should not speak of domestic affairs and women should not speak of external matters. The philosopher Dong Zhongshu elevated this to cosmology. Yang leads, yin supports, and this is the way of heaven. Within this framework, a woman participating in politics was not merely improper. It was a violation of the natural order. But the system had a fatal flaw. Emperors die. Emperors fall ill. Emperors sometimes take the throne at the age of 3. When an emperor cannot exercise power, who fills the vacuum? Ministers could, but ministers fight among themselves, and none has enough legitimacy to override the rest. Relatives of the empress could, but once they gain too much power, they might usurp the throne entirely. The only person who holds the emperor's trust through blood, yet theoretically cannot seize the throne for herself, is the emperor's mother. She will not usurp because she does not carry the imperial surname. She will not be accepted as a rival because she is a woman. Precisely because the system considers her incapable of becoming a threat, she becomes the safest option in a power vacuum. This is the structural entrance through which women entered power in Chinese history. They did not break in. The system pushed them forward when it was breaking down. The first woman to walk through that entrance was Empress. When Liu Ban died, his heir Liu Ying was 16 years old and temperamentally weak. Standing in the court were men like Han Xing, Xiao He, Cao Can, Chen Ping, and Zhou Bo, generals and strategists who had fought alongside Liu Ban through years of blood. Every one of them had more prestige, more military achievement, and more personal power than the teenage emperor, a fragile boy sitting among wolves. Without someone to hold the situation together, the throne might not have survived its first year. The person who held it together was Lu Hou. She was not a gentle woman. While Liu Ban was still alive, she had participated in the decision to execute Han Dynasty. She understood the logic of those battle-hardened men: devour whoever is weak. Her methods were extraordinarily brutal. She had Liu Ban's favorite concubine, Si Furen, mutilated, blinded, deafened, and thrown into a latrine, calling the result a human swine. Her own son, Liu Ying, witnessed this and was so traumatized that he withdrew from governing it entirely. By modern standards, this was pure atrocity. But placed back in its time, the context changes. Tifuren had spent years weeping before Liu Ban, begging him to depose Liu Ying and install her own son, Yu Shilko, Urge. In palace politics, this was not emotional manipulation. It was a fight to the death. If Liu Ruyi had become crown prince, Lu Hou and Liu Ying could both have been killed. The cruelty of Liu Hou's response was real, but so was the threat she faced. In a world with no legal protections, no safe exit, and where losing meant the execution of your entire family, cruelty was often a synonym for survival. Lu Hou held power for 15 years. While she lived, no one dared move against her. But within 2 months of her death, Zhou Bo and Chen Ping launched a coup and slaughtered the entire Lu clan. 15 years of power began its countdown the moment she stopped breathing, because her authority had never been granted by the system. It was held by personal force alone. When the force disappeared, everything returned to zero. 400 years later, another woman faced the same structural entrance, but made an entirely different choice. Zetian entered the center of power the same way Lu Hou had. Her husband could no longer function. Tang Dynasty suffered from severe chronic headaches and was frequently unable to manage state affairs. Zetian began by reviewing memorials on his behalf and gradually assumed control of the government. By the late years of Gaozong's reign, everyone inside and outside the court knew who was actually making decisions. But Zetian took a step that Lu Hou never dared. She declared herself emperor. In 690 AD, she deposed her own son, changed the dynasty's name to Zhou, and proclaimed herself sacred divine emperor. This was unprecedented in Chinese history. Not a woman governing from behind the scenes, not a dowager empress behind a curtain, but a woman formally seated on the dragon throne, receiving the prostration of every official in the empire. To understand how extraordinary this was, you must return to the social understanding of that era. In the Confucian order, a woman becoming emperor was not a violation of rules. It was an inversion of heaven and earth. The poet Luo Binwang, writing against her, did not accuse her of poor governance. He invoked the phrase, "The hen announces the dawn," a symbol of cosmic disorder. In that worldview, Zetian claiming the throne was equivalent to the sun rising in the west. How did she succeed? She exploited a unique cultural condition of the Han Dynasty. Tang society was far more open than later periods. The dynasty had inherited certain traditions from the Xianbei people of the northern dynasties, and women enjoyed considerably more social freedom. Women rode horses, played polo, and wore men's clothing in public. Tang princesses participating in politics was not unusual. This cultural flexibility gave Zetian an opening. Although a woman becoming emperor was still a shocking act, the society had enough elasticity to absorb it. Had she lived during the Southern Song or the Qing Dynasty, she could not have taken the first step. Zetian ruled for 15 years after claiming the throne. She used secret police to suppress opposition while aggressively expanding the imperial examination system, selecting talent from common families rather than relying on aristocratic networks. Her governing methods were not fundamentally different from any male emperors and were more effective than many. But in her final years, she faced an unsolvable problem: succession. Her sons carried the surname Li and belonged to the Tang imperial house. Her nephews carried the surname Wu and represented her own family. Passing the throne to a son meant admitting that her Zhou dynasty was merely an interruption in the Tang. Passing it to a nephew violated the basic human principle that a son is closer than a nephew. The minister Dian said one sentence that cut through everything. Would a nephew place his aunt in the ancestral temple? In 705 AD, Zetian fell gravely ill. The minister Zhang Zhenji launched a coup and forced her abdication. Her son, Li San, restored the Tang Dynasty. After her death, a stone tablet was erected before her tomb. It bore no inscription. That blank stela has been interpreted for 1,300 years without consensus. Some say she believed her achievements and failures should be left for posterity to judge. Others say she did not know what identity to present to history. Empress of the Tang? Emperor of the Zhou? A mother? A usurper? No existing category could contain her life. 1,000 years later, Empress Dowager Cixi faced the same structural entrance. The Shenfeng emperor had died, and the Tongzhi emperor was only 5 years old. The two dowager empresses governed from behind a curtain. Notice that curtain. Its meaning was precise. You may exercise power, but you must not be seen exercising power. The curtain was the system's final compromise for female authority. We need you to do what the emperor does, but we cannot admit that you are doing it. Cixi sat behind that curtain for nearly half a century. Like Lu Hou and Wu Zetian, she was extraordinarily intelligent, decisive, and ruthless. But the era she governed was fundamentally different. Lemothreased. You have an internal threats from founding-era generals. When the day elapsed between Cixi fragile books, choosing the era statement you steal jokes from Ruval. Body burbles. Imoskia faced. Impossible? It's impossible. This is where the cruelty of historical limitation becomes most visible. Ti's ability in court politics was equal to anyone's, but court politics was no longer the arena that determined China's fate. The Opium Wars, the self-strengthening movement, the Sino-Japanese War, the Boxer Rebellion, the problems she faced exceeded the boundaries of her education, her environment, and every cognitive framework available to her. She was not lacking in intelligence. Her intelligence simply belonged to a world that was disappearing. 3 women, 3 eras, the same entrance. They entered the center of power in almost identical ways. The system broke down, the male ruler failed, and a vacuum appeared. They were pushed forward, not because they were permitted, but because there was no better option. Each stabilized the situation in her own way. Liu kicked through iron will, Wu Zetian through institutional reform, Cixi through political maneuvering. But once the system recovered, the first thing it did was deny their existence. The Liu clan was massacred. The Wu Dynasty was erased. Cixi was condemned as the woman who ruined the nation. This is not a question of evaluating any individual woman. It is the logic of the system itself. When it needed them, it called them a necessary expedient. When it no longer needed them, it called them an aberration of the natural order. 2,000 years of imperial rule, and only one woman ever formally held the throne. But the women who actually exercised supreme power were far more numerous. They were not forgotten by history. They were simply never formally acknowledged by it. That blank stele has stood for 1,300 years, and no one has yet been able to write a single word upon it that everyone agrees with. Perhaps that silence is the only honest answer.